There's been growing speculation about the future of New Zealand's Prime Minister Christopher Luxon. Low polling figures have sparked a revolt among some MPs in his own National Party. But Mr. Luxon says he won't be resigning ahead of a general election in November. I spoke to Ben Thomas, who is a political commentator and former National Government Press Secretary. He broke down the polling results for us.
Look, Christopher Luxon is in a difficult position. He's the leader of the first genuine three-way coalition government under the mixed member proportional electoral system that we've had in New Zealand for 30 years now. And that's made it much harder to sort of, be this kind of presidential leader. He's had to make a lot of compromises. And of course, he's been dogged by an economy that just hasn't been in recovery mode, after promising to get the country back on track. So that's hitting both the National Party that he leads, their polling, really firming up around the sort of 30% mark, which is a sort of extraordinary number for a party that may actually still be returned to government with its coalition partners. But, look, some of that is being sheeted home to Luxon, who is not the most sort of charismatic leader, not the best communicator, in New Zealand politics or New Zealand political history. Perhaps, that he hasn't told the story right, that he's mishandled some caucus management. So, look, he is in a slightly, he is in a difficult position. He's been in a difficult position for a long time. But, it's not clear that any move is going to be made on him.
Yes, and even if there is one, would you expect something to happen in the coming months or so if the polling figures, we'll get to those polling figures a bit later, but if, the low polling figures do ensue as the weeks and months go on?
Yeah, look, you can either approach it rationally, put up the pros on one side, that, maybe you get a leader who's a better communicator, maybe you get a chance to sort of reset the narrative. The cons on the other side, the public doesn't tend to like instability. They don't like to see a party focusing on themselves during a time of sort of economic and currently severe weather crises. Or you could approach it less rationally, which I think is probably how a lot of the members of the National Caucus will be looking at it as they start to look at, perhaps not being returned to their marginal electorates because of the lower polling. And actually, they're kind of being squeezed on both ends uniquely, which is that some of the sort of backbenchers in these marginal electorates are looking at not being returned. But because National actually has a large number of electorate seats, its list MPs under the MMP system, they're actually at real risk as well because, they won't get enough votes on current polling to bring in their finance minister, who is a list MP. Perhaps their third-ranked minister, Chris Bishop, who's a list MP, or who may be a list MP if he loses his marginal electorate. And so there's a lot of, there are a lot of stress points for different reasons within the caucus, that can, kind of precipitate action, I suppose.
Let's look at Christopher Luxon first. TVNZ variant poll had him at just 16% for preferred PM. How bad is that figure and what's behind it?
It's very low. It's very low for a prime minister in particular. Look, as I mentioned, Christopher Luxon has never really had that bounce or that honeymoon that you tend to get as a first-term prime minister. He's had to share the spotlight with his very experienced and very assertive coalition partners. Winston Peters, the leader of New Zealand First. New Zealand First has been making huge gains at National's expense. They're up to 15% in some polls, over doubling their last election night result. And the ACT Party, staying pretty steady, but also being very assertive within that coalition. The other major thing is just the economy. The National government was, the National-led government rather, was elected on the basis of cost of living, getting the country back on track, like so many governments in 2023 were, and the economic recovery hasn't really played ball. And just as it was sort of taking its sort of first faltering sort of fawn steps, the war in Iran has happened, and everything's been knocked off course, and we're hitting another cost of living crisis, and that's just bad news for National, which in particular, with the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister, even within the coalition government, they own the economy as an issue.
And the party itself, it's polling at about 30%. That's behind Labour. Is it too early to say that Labour is in pole position, I suppose, heading into November elections?
Yeah, look, it is too early to say that because the crucial thing is that a block of parties can put together 50% plus one of the vote. Labour has consolidated its position, quite improbably, given its last election result, as the party with the single most support, but it's only got the Green Party and Te Pāti Māori way further on the left, which is currently sort of tearing itself apart in a civil war, as support parties, whereas the coalition parties, on most polling, the coalition as a whole is actually standing up pretty well. But what's changing is the composition within the coalition, with New Zealand First a more conservative, more interventionist, socially conservative party really going from strength to strength in the polls, and National really in decline.
Would you expect ACT and also New Zealand First to perhaps be in discussions, perhaps to among MPs and the Nationals, to perhaps sway the party to perhaps, look at someone else to lead it?
Yeah, look, it's an interesting line that they run because having Christopher Luxon, a less experienced Prime Minister who, to his credit, he is very good at sort of turning a blind eye and not rising to the bait of his coalition partners. So they sort of enjoy that kind of long leash, I suppose. They don't have any real interest in a stronger National because a stronger National probably takes votes back off them. Where they would be worried is if the vote just sort of falls off a cliff and goes in all directions, including to the centre-left, and makes it harder for them to form a government.
And just very quickly, at this stage, what would be some of the main issues that would be on top of voters' minds?
Look, number one is cost of living. Like most Western democracies, cost of living has been the number one issue for all voters for the last, 4 years now. That's not going to change. In fact, it's just becoming more exacerbated by the fuel crisis. So that's number one. There are some culture war issues that New Zealand First have been very successful at sort of, running up the flagpole. The India-New Zealand Fair Trade Agreement is one of those. They're sort of playing on fears of rampant immigration to try and turn that into a bit of a political football. So, look, I think those are the key ones, but ultimately it's a hip pocket election and who's going to be more trusted on the economy.
Okay, Ben Thomas, really good to get your insights there, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.